his soul goes marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. But his soul goes marching on. The stars above in heaven are looking kindly down. The stars above in heaven are looking kindly down. The stars above in heaven are looking kindly down on the grave of old John Brown.
That was Pete Seeger with his song John Brown's Body about the legendary John Brown. John Brown is one of the most controversial and fascinating figures in American history. Hello everyone, my name is Muhammad Khan and I'm a history major, and I've always been intrigued by John Brown, and I decided to do a podcast on him. I made this podcast to try to make the listener who has never heard about John Brown, or to those who know about him, but to understand and to explain to them why he did what he did. And as the podcast finishes, you'll find out. For those who don't know about him, you'll find out what he did, and for those who do know, you'll understand the context, and you'll understand why he did what he did. Even if you know or you don't know, you'll understand. So for this podcast, I used a number of resources for it. First of all, I'd like to apologize for the bad audio. I don't have the proper equipment for this. This is my first ever podcast, so bear with me. If at least you can hear me, that's good enough. The main book I read for this was a book written by W.E.B. Du Bois, and that was the main book I did my research on. But I did read some other books, one written by Louis A. DeCaro, and I've also looked up in some other books by Howard Zinn and James Lowen for information and research about John Brown. But most of the information in this podcast is from the book written by W.E.B. Du Bois. For those who don't know who he is, he was a historian. His full name is William Edward Burghard Du Bois. He was a French African American. His parents were from immigrants. Obviously, they were from Africa, but they lived in France and they immigrated to the United States. And so he's John Brown's main biographer. Long story short, John Brown was an abolitionist. He was against slavery, and he wanted to end it. Now I ask everybody, whether you know about John Brown or you don't know about John Brown, which one of you would have been against slavery if you were living in those times when slavery was legal? Which one of you would have been against it? I guarantee you, all of you who are listening to this podcast would raise your hand and say, I would be against slavery. Now, the second question, how would you end slavery? How would you end it? Now, this is where everybody will differ. A lot of people will differ. Some people will say you go through Congress, you go through the Congress, you elect politicians, or you do this route that John Brown did, was an insurrection. So I'll explain what the conditions were that led John Brown to think of an insurrection, okay? I assume most of you who are listening and know about American history know the history of slavery in America and how the slaves got here. In the book by W.E.B. Du Bois, he says, "These black men came not of their own willing, but because the hasty greed of a new America selfishly and half-thoughtlessly sought to revive in the New World the dying but unforgotten custom of enslaving the world's workers." Slavery was common throughout the world, and it was mainly African slaves, and they were working throughout the world, and America decided to get in on that, and they basically stole the people from Africa and brought them to America against their own will. Hearing that, any good-hearted person would feel horrified by that. Hearing that people were kidnapped from their ancestral lands and brought to a nation they knew nothing about. to understand the story of John Brown, the way I'm gonna organize this podcast is first tell you how he was brought up, and then I'll tell you about his upbringing, and then three famous events that John Brown, one event that influenced him, and the other two he was involved in. So we'll start with his upbringing first. He was born on May 9th, 1800, in Torrington, Connecticut. And then when he was 5, his family migrated to Ohio in 1805 when John was 5. John's father, his name was Owen Brown. He was a respected religious man. John's mother died before he was 8. And so you see John, for his mother to die at 8, he had early struggles. Also, his father had a severe stuttering problem. So John had his struggles early in his life. And like I mentioned, his father was a religious man. John he grew up in a religious environment. And he also liked to work hard. He didn't have any formal education. W.E.B. Du Bois writes in his book, he would always choose to stay at home and work hard rather than be sent to school. He read the Bible a lot as a kid. He grew to be a firm believer in the divine authenticity of the Bible. And a lot of these quotes most of these quotes that I'm reading are from W.E.B. Du Bois' book, and some are from John Brown's, the book by Louis de Caro. And so, like I said, he grew to be a firm believer in the divine authenticity of the Bible. To him, the cruel grandeur of the Old Testament was as true as the love and sacrifice of the New, and both mingled to mold his soul. This will give you some general idea of the first 15 years of his life, during which time he became very strong and large of his age, and ambitious to perform the full labor of a man at almost any kind of hard work. When John Brown was 12, he was born in 1800, so that means in 1812 he was 12. Easy to figure that one out. But in American history, 1812 is a significant year because of the War of 1812. And General Hull had a disastrous campaign during that war, and it brought the scene of fighting near his western home, him being John Brown. The war was brought near to his home, and the fighting was brought near to his home, and the effect of what John Brown saw during the war went so far to disgust him with military affairs that he would neither train nor deal with them, or he would neither train nor drill with the military. So this, to me, indicates his distrust early on in his life of the American system and the military. So that's a significant incident to me, and it'll put the context what happens later in John's life. And so the first main in all these years in John's young life, the main event that happened when he was 12 is that he met a slave boy at 12 years old. In all the years, this one incident stands out above all the others. During the war, there was a landlord that invited John to his house, and at the house, John noticed a black boy in the yard, and this black boy was half naked and wretched. And John would hear how his landlord and his folk would talk to this black boy. It was a very harsh abuse to the black boy. And at night, the slave lay bitter and cold, and once they beat the wretched thing before John's eyes with an iron shovel. So John hears abuse towards this black boy, and he sees him being beaten by an iron shovel. At this point, I forgot to mention a very key point. John Brown was a white abolitionist, okay? And these people that were, doing this to the black boy were white, because most of the landlords were white, and most of the slave owners were white. It's just a fact. So, but John didn't hate the black boy as, the landlord did and his folk did. John actually admired the black boy. That black boy worked and worked hard and steadily was in John's eyes no hardship, rather a pleasure. John actually acknowledged him fully, if not more than his equal. So here's a young white boy acknowledging and using his natural, I guess what you can say, his natural being. Racism and hatred are taught, okay? And you see, John Brown didn't go to school. The slaves, they didn't go to school either. So he has a lot in common with these slaves, and he sees them as their equal. He sees them as, no different than he is. So that's the story of that. So this incident with the slave boy had a profound effect on him and how he views black people. So in 1819, when John was 19, he joined a school among students, and in this school he was among the students of Reverend Moses Hollock at Plainfield, Massachusetts, where men prepared for Amherst College. So he moved from Ohio to Massachusetts for school. At this time, John had great confidence in himself. One of his classmates said about him, he followed up with great tenacity whatever he set about, as long as it answered his great general purpose. So he always had this confidence, this sense of purpose. And the War of 1812 was over, and it was followed by hard times. His father, Owen, wrote, money became scarce, property fell, and that which I thought well bought would not bring its cost. I had made 3 or 4 large purchases in which I was a heavy loser. So John Brown comes from a poor, humble, religious background with a sense of purpose. His upbringing was most likely different than other white families. He didn't have success in school. As blacks, as I mentioned, blacks and slaves didn't have education. His environment conditioned him to naturally sympathize with blacks. As I said, hatred is taught. It's not a human tendency. It's not natural for a human being to hate another person based on the color of his skin. Now, I don't know, this is a side note, but I don't know recently if you've seen this video. It hit the internet about a few months ago. There was a video of these 2 kids. One was black, one was white. And when they saw each other in the street, they just became joyed and happy, and they ran to each other smiling and laughing, saying, "Yay, yay." So this tells you that, slavery is taught. This is my point. Racism is taught. It's not a natural thing. And John was a natural human being. It sounds weird to say, but he wasn't brought up to hate black people. And to all the white listeners that are listening to this, I'm not saying all white people are bad. So please don't feel bad listening to this, okay? You guys are more than welcome to listen to this. I got no hatred for white people. I'm just saying, a lot of, it's true that most of the slave owners were white. So I'm just stating that as a fact, okay? Now moving on to what John did as a young man. He worked as a tanner from the age of 15 to 20. He spent most of his time working at the tanners or at courier's trade. During this, he became a natural leader. He was a natural born leader, but this is when he became confident in commanding people. So, he felt like he could do things, and during his years as a tanner, he learned how to lead. He learned how to lead a group of men. So moving on, I'm going to talk a little more about John's father. I failed to mention, I don't know why I didn't mention this at the beginning. Yes, he was a religious man, but he didn't own slaves. He himself was an abolitionist. So that's another reason. That's another condition of why John didn't see hatred towards black people, or he didn't see them as less than human. There was a time where Owen Brown lived. There was a slaveholding minister named Thompson. He brought his slaves north and preached in a local church. Then, when he attempted to take them back to the south, the slaves weren't willing to go. Okay, and Thompson said, "I married them myself, and I did not enjoy obedience on the woman." So, in other words, it didn't matter what the woman or the slaves wanted. Whatever he wanted for them, that's what they did. And Owen Brown saw this and said, um, "Ever since then, I have been an abolitionist." Owen Brown felt it was wrong what the slaveholder was doing. And so, to recap all this, John has met a slave boy when he was 12. His dad was an abolitionist. So this environment influenced his sympathy with the black slave. Okay, moving on. As I mentioned in the beginning of the podcast, I said there were three events that John is known for, or I should say there's two events that he's known for to the public nationally, to the American history books. But there was one incident that actually inspired him. Like I said, there was three incidents. One inspired him. This is the one that inspired him. And that was the Nat Turner's Insurrection Rebellion. This happened in 1831 in Virginia. The slavery problem was becoming more charged. The discussion of the measure was fierce in John Brown's neighborhood, and it must have strengthened his dislike of slavery and turned his earnest mind more and more toward the Negroes. John heard about the raid. The father of the town where John lived in Pennsylvania, Squire Hudson, was happy to hear about the raid. In quote, Squire Hudson said, "The slaves have risen down in Virginia and are fighting for their freedom, as we did for ours. I pray to God that they may get it." So, I assume when he says fighting for freedom as we did was fighting the British for the Revolution, the American Revolution. That's what I assume. I don't know. But he sees the slaves fighting for freedom as he did. So, in John Brown's native state of Kentucky, another incident happened. In his native state of Connecticut, a white woman was shamefully persecuted for attempting to teach Negroes. So all of this, Nat Turner's insurrection. Nat Turner was a black man. He was a black slave that led an insurrection. Okay, and the father of his town wants freedom for blacks and supports insurrection. A white woman was shamed for trying to educate blacks in his home state. Black churches and schools were burned in his black state, in his home state. So all of this inspired or made Brown develop a deep feeling of dislike towards slavery and made it more definite and purposeful for him to fight against slavery. So John Brown really wants to help the black slaves and the black people. And to me, this is a very poignant thing he did in 1834. He outlined a plan for the slaves, an education for them, or he outlined a plan for Negro education. In a letter he wrote to his brother, he says, "My wife and 3 boys, we have agreed to get at least one Negro boy or youth and bring him up as we do our own. Give him a good English education, teach him what we can about the history of the world, and try to teach him to fear God." It's funny that I should mention this, but it's true. It's conscious. It might be hurt a few people's feelings, but John Brown's doing more. This is definitely more than the presidents were doing for the slaves. So obviously you hear people, in John Brown's whole hometown, the white woman being shamed to educate blacks, and he's doing everything he can to help slaves, and he's not letting that get in the way to help slaves. So I think that's a very poignant thing John Brown did. So some comments other people made about John. I got this information from the book written by Louis A. DeCaro, um, his book about John Brown, and he mentions after the Harpers Ferry raid, which I'll get to at the end of the podcast. While he was in jail for that Harper's raid, for the Harper Ferry's raid, he was friends with a future Republican senator, and that senator's name was Morrow B. Lowry, which is crazy to think about. And at the time, Republicans were against slavery. That's crazy to think about today. We think about Republicans today, how crazy they are, but back then they were against slavery. That's a crazy thing to think about. They were the good guys back then. Anyway, Morrow Lowry said about John, "I have never known a man who had a deeper sense of the claims of God and a man upon him than John Brown. It was this deepening sense of divine vocation and political responsibility that ultimately drove him toward anti-slavery militancy." And I should also mention there was the killing of an abolitionist, Elijah Lovejoy, in Alton, Illinois, in November of 1837. And during a prayer in response to this killing of Elijah Lovejoy, Brown made a vow, and he says he said, "I devote my life to increasing hostility towards slavery." So, in conclusion of all this, I feel, Muhammad Khan, I feel that John Brown felt it was a religious duty to help the slaves get their freedom. So moving on, now we get to Bleeding Kansas. Oh, Bleeding Kansas. This was the first big event John Brown was involved in. Like, this is when he became an outlaw. So the story goes, okay, slavery wasn't going away. Okay, it was growing, and it began to move westward, and this angered the abolitionists such as John Brown, and John Brown swore blood feud with this sum of all villainous. A sum of all villainous. That's, I don't know if that's pronouncing that right, but that's what it says in the book. So like I said, the South wanted to expand westward. First they enslaved Missouri in the Missouri Compromise, where the South received Missouri and the North received Maine. Also, the main thing to come out of this compromise was slavery was banned in the North above the 3630 parallel, excluding Missouri. It was basically this line in the middle of the U.S., the United States, that said anything to the North was a free state and anything to the South was a slave state, excluding Missouri. However, this Missouri Compromise was repealed in the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1856, and because Nebraska and Kansas were above this 36 parallel, a conflict happened between the abolitionists and the pro-slavery people. So, upon hearing this news, John Brown had 6 sons, but 5 of them were greatly interested in defending Kansas from enslavement. His 5 sons, John Jr., Jason, Owen, Frederick, and Solomon, made their way onto Kansas in October of 1854. And in June of 1855, John Brown attended the Syracuse Convention of Abolitionists. Then after that convention, he moved towards Kansas with his 6th son and son-in-law in September. And so John arrived in Kansas on October 6th, 1855. I'm quickly going through this. It's like a timeline, so bear with me. But I will explain. I'm explaining this as thorough as possible. So, John Brown arrives in Kansas in October, and in October of 1855. And then on May 21st, 1866, pro-slavery forces took over Lawrence, Kansas, and burned it and sacked it. This is also known as the sacking of Lawrence. And John Brown responded to this by saying he was indigent, meaning he was very angry, that there had been no resistance, that Lawrence was not defended, and he denounced members of the committee and leading free state men as cowards or worse. So he was offended that no one defended these people of Lawrence from these pro-slavery people. Like, he expects, John Brown would say talk is cheap, it's time to act. So he was upset that these people who called themselves free state men didn't do anything. So he called them cowards or worse. So 5 days later, May 26th, 1856, John ordered 5 pro-slavery men to be killed on Potawatomi. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. So he ordered the killing of 5 pro-slavery men on Potawatomi in response to the sacking of Lawrence. And after this, John became an outlaw. Okay, but also he wouldn't say much about the incident. I think because he just he didn't want to indict himself. He didn't want to get arrested. He was kind of smart in that. But news spread about this. And a friend of him asked him, did he kill those 5 people? News was spreading that John Brown had killed all these 5 pro-slavery men. And John replied to that, no, I did not. But I do not pretend to say that they were not killed by my order. And in doing so, I believe I was doing God's service. So, as I was saying, this event that happened at Potawatomi, it became known as the Potawatomi Massacre or murders. And some people say this was justified, some people say it wasn't. Even John's sons were uncomfortable with it. But whatever the case, whatever you believe, this happened. John escaped and became an outlaw. So now after this Potawatomi Massacre, this is when John proceeds to fulfill his plan of an insurrection in Harpers Ferry. Now, as you remember earlier in the podcast, I mentioned that Nat Turner's insurrection. So I believe that insurrection inspired John's inspiration of this insurrection that he planned. So Harpers Ferry is in Virginia, what is now today West Virginia, but at the time it was Virginia. Okay, this is the place where John Brown chose to attack American slavery. So there's 2 reasons, one is minor and one is major, of why John Brown chose Harpers Ferry for the raid. The minor one, according to W.E.B. Du Bois, if I'm mispronouncing Du Bois' last name, I apologize. I don't speak French. To all you French listeners, I'm sorry. But W.E.B. Du Bois says the minor reason was that Harpers Ferry was the location of the U.S. arsenal, meaning military weapons was stored there. And his plan was to capture those weapons, because it was so necessary for the raid. But the major reason, according to W.B. Du Bois, was that Harpers Ferry was the best way to enter the Great Black Way, or the Black Belt. And the Black Belt was a region where 3 or 4 million slaves lived. So, the plan was to collect arms from the arsenal, give it to the slaves, and lead an insurrection and free the slaves. Only a few slaves joined him. And I should also mention, an insurrection is basically arming people of weapons, okay, and going on it's supplying, I guess you can say, people with weapons, okay. But these people aren't like military people. These are regular people that are being armed. But John Brown is doing this because he wants to end slavery, and he feels bad about the black slave, the plight of the black slaves. So he collected arms. So his plan was to collect the arms, give it to the slaves, and lead an insurrection and free the slaves in the Black Belt. Excuse me. But only a few slaves joined him, and he and his followers, the slaves that did join him, were captured. And unfortunately, John was tried for treason in the state of Virginia, and he was found guilty. And he was hanged for this. Okay, his plan was obviously it was a far-fetched plan, but he meant well. He wanted to free the slaves. He wanted justice for them. He saw people in power were doing nothing to stop its continuation.